6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The History with Jackson podcast. Hello and welcome back to the History with Jackson podcast. I'm your host, Jackson, and in today's episode, I'm talking to Chris Birkett all about his brand new book, Bill Clinton at the Church of Baseball, the Presidency, Civil Religion, and the National Pastime in the 1990s. Now, I was super excited to do this episode. Those who know me know that I love nothing more than sport, history, and politics. And when I had the opportunity to do an episode where I merge all three of those, I was super excited. So I hope that you guys enjoy this episode. It is an awesome episode. Me and Chris talk about some of the major baseball stories of the 1990s, but some of the major political stories and scandals of Bill Clinton's presidency. Now, without further ado, I'll leave you with Chris. So, hello and welcome back to the History of Jackson podcast. Today we're talking to historian and author Chris Birkett all about his brand new book, Bill Clinton at the Church of Baseball, the Presidency, Civil Religion and the National Pastime in the 1990s. Now, I love baseball. As someone who spent a couple of years in the US and Canada watching baseball teams, I'm really excited for this one. So, how are you doing, Chris?
I'm doing very well. Thank you very much for having me on your podcast, Jackson.
No, it's more than okay. Any chance to talk about history and sport, I will take it any day of the week. But I suppose the first question I have for you, Chris, and I do this for all our guests here, what was the inspiration behind writing this book?
Well, the seeds of this book go back about 30 years. I was working as a news producer for the BBC in Washington in the mid-90s, and I was deployed to go down to Baltimore to see a baseball game, which involved a character called Cal Ripken Jr. We may speak about him a bit later in this podcast. And he was playing his 2,131st game in a row, and this without missing a game. And this particular game had become a massive event in America. He was all over everywhere, all over the media. And the event was significant because all he was doing was just turning up for work each day. But nevertheless, he became this sort of symbol of American virtue. And the BBC thought it was worth doing a piece on this. So I was sent down there to produce for BBC Breakfast, which was fairly new at the time, and for the radio. So we went down, we covered it. And when I got there, I hadn't known in advance that Bill Clinton was going to be there. And I was only told when I was on the field in the batting practice session, and we were told to clear the field for the sweep because the president was coming. Anyway, Clinton came there. He didn't actually go onto the field of play at all. He didn't make a speech, but he very much became part of the event because he commentated on a couple of innings for both TV and radio. And there was a lot of coverage of his presence there. And he went into the dressing room afterwards and spoke to Cal Ripken. And I just filed this thought away for some time. I was in and out of Washington for the rest of the 90s. And I kind of observed the way that sport and politics sort of melded so frequently, particularly in America. And I carried on covering American politics for the BBC and the Sky News for many years thereafter. And the next president, George W. Bush, he was a baseball owner himself. And the next president, Barack Obama, famously got rid of the tennis court at the White House to repaint the tennis court with a basketball court so he could carry on playing basketball with his mates and NBA stars that dropped into the White House. So I always thought to myself, there's a relationship going on there between the presidency and sport that I think deserves explanation. But it's not just a sort of performative relationship. It must also have some sort of political impact, some political meaning. So when, about 10 years ago now, I decided to sort of step aside from the sort of run of daily journalism, which I've been doing for 30 years, and move into academia, I had this seeds of an idea about doing something about the relationship between presidency and sport in America. And this was crystallized by a supervisor I had for both my master's and my PhD at King's, called Uta Balbier, who is now a professor of modern history at Oxford. And she introduced me to the concept of civil religion, this idea that a fusion of, if you like, of faith and patriotism, of the secular symbols and rituals and practices which become accepted by a nation and come to symbolize a nation and become to, if you like, take on quasi-religious meaning, take the form of a religion, although they're not a religion. And I think when you see the relationship between sport and the presidency, and particularly baseball and the presidency, and then I see you see this civil religion at work, if you like, and that's where the idea of this book came from, initially in a PhD and now sort of published in America this month.
I love hearing this from historians, how one experience that you had and one thing that you witnessed turned into a career, really, and an interest that you keep exploring. I think it's always really nice to see that development for historians. And you've touched there upon that theme of civil religion and the tying together of politics, presidents, and baseball. Whilst many listeners to this podcast are American, many of them English, and we were talking about this beforehand, about people assuming a level of interest and knowledge of different cultural points from different countries. But some people might not be aware of just the popularity and the cultural importance that baseball has in the United States. Could you just unpack that for some of our listeners who might not be aware of that?
Well, undoubtedly, in my opinion, and though historians and political scientists and other academics might discuss this or dispute this or contest this, but undoubtedly, I think baseball carries the sort of cultural baggage of America more than any other sport. That doesn't mean to say that it's the most popular sport in America, because it isn't. I mean, NFL is undoubtedly the most popular sport in America. NBA basketball is more popular than baseball. If you talk about the eyeballs that watch it and the dollars that are spent on it, those two sports are, and also the polls that say, what's your favorite sport? Baseball is eclipsed by both those two and has been since the 1970s. But I think if you think of the cultural presence in the American story, baseball is unrivaled. We'll probably might talk a bit about the history of baseball and, it's growing up with the urbanization of America and how the growth of baseball in America sort of ran parallel with each other. We can talk about that at length as well. But I really just want to focus on, if you like, its cultural presence at the moment, if you like, and certainly in the 90s. I made a list just before we came on, Jackson. I made a list of phrases that come from baseball, everyday English phrases that come from baseball. And I'll just quickly run through them. If you get brushed backed by someone, that's from you get a brushback from someone, that's baseball. If you're a big hitter, that's baseball. If you're just touching base with someone, that's baseball. If you're stepping up to the plate to do something, that's baseball. If you're throwing a curveball at someone, that's baseball. If something's in the ballpark, that's baseball. If it comes from left field, that's baseball. If you take a rain check, that's baseball. If it's 3 times you're out, then that's baseball. If you knock it out of the park, that's baseball. If it's a whole new ball game, that's baseball. I mean, I could just go on and on and on with all these cultural references in language. I don't need to go there. So there's language. There's literature. If you think of the authors that have written about it, Don DeLillo, Thomas Wolfe, Paul Auster, Philip Roth, all written extensively about baseball. If you think of in my view, if you think of the 3 biggest cultural figures in 20th century America, I would say, and again, this is completely up for argument, I don't know what your 3 would be, Jackson, but my 3 would be Elvis, Muhammad Ali, and Babe Ruth. Elvis and Muhammad Ali, anybody, under the age of 40 will probably, 40 or whatever, would know who I'm talking about. Babe Ruth, they might not do, but an icon of American culture in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s that unrivaled his fame, and his fame was such that he could more than talk to the president as an equal. He could talk down to the president, and often did. And that just shows you how important Babe Ruth was. So I think there are all those things. Then there are phrases, say it ain't so, Joe. It ain't over till it's over. These are all phrases that have come from baseball. And that's before we get into the whole business of the completely dubious, indeed artificial creation story around baseball, the fictitious 1839 first pitch, which gave baseball an American creation story, unlike football. Clearly baseball wasn't invented in America in 1839. I mean, we all, whether it comes from cricket or rounders, or whether rounders comes from baseball, as some argue, it certainly wasn't invented in 1839 in America. But of course, every religion has to have a creation story. So baseball created its creation story around Abner Doubleday in 1839. And it stuck with it really largely until the Second World War, when historians started saying, hey guys, this simply isn't true.
It's just really like such a great sport to watch, and some of those names that you mentioned, Muhammad Ali, but particularly Babe Ruth is just such a huge figure, as you were alluding to there, such a huge figure in American culture. And even over here, we've got books. I remember sitting in primary school reading a book about some child who'd gone back in time and it ended up meeting Babe Ruth.
Yeah, I mean, certainly my mum, who is 90 now, but I mean, Babe Ruth was a massive cultural figure. She was born in the 1930s. Babe Ruth was a massive cultural figure to her, and she's got nothing to do with America or baseball or anything, and has lived in Britain all her life. But there he is. He's still a cultural figure. He was a worldwide cultural figure, despite the fact that he was, an American baseball player.
It brings an interesting point actually there, that Babe Ruth being able to transcend America and go across different continents as a cultural icon. How does baseball then mirror American history, particularly in the 1990s?
I think if you look at the history of baseball, and many historians have done this, you can certainly trace the history of America through the history of baseball. It became known as the national pastime initially in the mid-19th century, when that phrase first appeared in newspapers. And then what we see in baseball as it becomes professionalized, as we see, and urbanized, we see an increasingly urbanized sport, the sport taken from the rural into the urban, in an increasingly urbanizing America. And we then get America becoming consumer orientated, commercial, advertising. Baseball takes up all these aspects. We see capital versus labor. We see disputes between the workers and the owners, the players and the owners, reflected in America. We see the battle for civil rights, if you like, previewed by Jackie Robinson's breaking through the color barrier in the 1940s, as a forerunner for the civil rights battles of the 1950s. So we see corruption, we see heroism, we see all the aspects that of America together, and the way that American society has perceived itself and been perceived. We see them reflected in baseball. So I think, as I said before, I think the cultural claims of baseball stand pretty good examination compared to those of other sports.
Thank you for giving us that brief detail about America's relationship with baseball and how it's reflected, because I think it gives us a really nice piece of context now for discussing the other main character within your book, which is Bill Clinton. Now, how does Bill Clinton start to utilize baseball and its image to help his own image in his election campaigns in the 1990s?
Well, this is where I think what I've done with Bill Clinton is quite interesting, and where people who talk to me about this say, "Oh, I didn't know Bill Clinton was a baseball fan," because in actual fact, he wasn't notably a baseball fan. The way that Clinton used sport was much more was really as a spectator, as part of building his image as a regular guy. James Carville, one of his advisors, said of him, he eats too much, he loves sport too much, he talks too much. And they feared that this sort of the guy that Clinton was portraying, this regular guy image, sort of lacked the gravitas to be president. So if we're talking about Clinton and sport, then I think we have something here that Clinton did use in his early campaigns. This idea that he was a regular guy, a sports fan. He was the same as the ESPN watching guys in America. You'd like to have a beer with him and sit and watch sport. That was what he regularly did. He'd sit at home and watch Sports Center and ESPN, and he'd watch all the live games, and he'd shout and do it. That was the image he was trying to create. The idea that he actually particularly liked baseball, I would challenge, because his real love was basketball. He was absolutely mad about basketball. He was mad about Arkansas Razorbacks, who he watched when he was a law professor in Fayetteville, and he carried on watching when he was president. So he was a big college basketball fan. He'd played a bit of basketball at school. He wasn't a natural athlete in any sense. He was a bit ungainly and sort of big to be sort of a natural athlete, but he did play a bit of church league basketball. Incidentally, when he came to Britain and went to Oxford, they saw his physique and decided he'd be better as a in the scrum at rugby. So he played second row scrum for his college in the second 15. But anyway, that's an aside. It was noted when he was on the campaign trail, it was in 1992 for his first election, it was noted that he actually wasn't very good at interacting with people about baseball by one of his advisors, because the Pittsburgh Pirates were playing in the National League Championship Series during the last few days of that campaign in October 1992. And he was on a campaign visit to Pittsburgh, and the fans were all talking about the previous night's game, and Clinton wasn't really able to sort of engage with them about the details of it. And baseball really is all about the details. I mean, as you know yourself, Jackson, everybody loves the stats and the numbers and all that. It's all about that. And Clinton wasn't able to talk to the fans about those sort of things. And his advisor noted that he was never much of a baseball fan. That showed that he was never much of a baseball fan. And one of his best friends, who's the historian Taylor Branch, said that he only really had the same sort of knowledge as baseball as most politicians had. So he wasn't particularly a baseball fan, but he was a massive, massive sports fan. But the fact that he wasn't a baseball fan, I think, makes his engagements with the baseball that much more interesting, because it shows that they were done with a kind of conscious knowledge of the cultural weight that baseball had in American society, even in the 1990s, where many thought because of it, it was sort of overshadowed by the NFL, and because it was beset by labour problems that meant there were strikes and the such like, that baseball's influence was on the way.
There seems to be a certain skill and finesse later on within his presidency about the way that he interacts with baseball and the way that he interacts with people about baseball, which, considering that he wasn't a big fan, you only need to watch Moneyball to figure out how much statistics there actually is in baseball.
Let me just flip it around a second, though. To say he wasn't a big fan, I think, is true. But of course, he did grow up in the 1950s. And if you grew up in the 1950s, when baseball was the number one sport, more than football, college basketball was and NBA was in its infancy. I think you have to acknowledge that though he wouldn't have been, an obsessive fan about baseball, the very fact that he would have grown up listening to baseball commentaries as a child, ball by ball commentaries of the games, while he was sitting at home in Hot Springs, listening to the St. Louis Cardinals with their games broadcast by KMOX, right across the whole of the Midwest and South, then I think that did capture him in a way. I mean, he was captured, if you like, by the cultural presence of baseball, even if it wasn't his number one sport at the time, in the same way that basketball came to be. So though I don't want you to think that he was not a fan. It was just that it wasn't his sporting priority. But I think he was well aware of the kind of cultural significance of the sport.
And certainly certainly if it's what you're growing up with, it's hard not to be.
Exactly.
But you mentioned something very interesting within one of your answers there about labour strikes and baseball having several issues within the sport within the 90s. And in the 1994, you see the MLB players, Major League Baseball players, going on strike. Why did Clinton feel the need to get involved in this dispute, and what was the reaction to that involvement?
So I think there are maybe three reasons why he gets involved in the dispute, and let's sort of separate them out. I mean, firstly, there's a very good electoral reason. The 94-95 strike threatened to disrupt completely what's known as spring training. Our American listeners obviously will be very familiar with spring training, but for any non-Americans, it's the moment when all the major league clubs decamp either to Arizona or to Florida into sort of training camps, and they play exhibition games, and thousands of fans come down from the chilly north and the Midwest down to these training camps in Arizona and Florida to watch their teams play exhibition games, and also to sort of take in a bit of sunshine and do all the sort of normal touristy things. And these are hugely important economic events for Arizona and Florida. And what do you know? Florida was a swing state even then. Clinton won it by less than a point in 1992. And Arizona was a swing state the other way. Bush had won it by less than 2 points in 1992. So both of these two states were in danger of losing their spring training because of the strike, and that would potentially have significant electoral impact on Clinton. But also, I think there was another thing at play, which was that he kind of basically just thought that it was his job as president to protect baseball. And I just want to read you a quote that I was given by, I'll just find it in my book if that's okay. Read you a quote that Mike McCurry, who was Clinton's spin doctor from 1994 to 1998, gave me when I was interviewing him about this very subject a couple of years ago. And he said to me, and I quote, I asked him about, why did, I asked him the question that you asked me, why did Clinton intervene? And he said, I remember thinking to myself, this doesn't require spin, it's baseball. Presidents are supposed to do baseball, that's what they do. It's part of what the deal is if you're president of the United States. And then he looked at me and he said, people searching for some other motive in Clinton's actions are overthinking. Well, as someone who's doing research into a book and a PhD, being accused of overthinking is an occupational hazard. But I think what he was driving at there was that one of the motivations for Clinton doing it was just that that's what you do if you're president. It's part of the duty of a president. It's part of the, if you like, the civil religious duty of the president to do that. So I think that did play a part in what Clinton was thinking about then. He just thought, I can't have baseball dying on my watch. What would that look like if I was the president and baseball died on my watch? Because this strike had led to the cancellation of the World Series. There was a real danger that spring training wasn't going to happen, that the next, there was no guarantee the next World Series would happen. So I think, there was a strong element of him just thinking, it's my duty to do it. But also I think there's a third element of play here, which is relating to the sort of political landscape of the time. And that's in 1994, Clinton is a uniquely unpopular president by the standards of those days. In actual fact, by current standards, he'd be doing all right. But in those days, a approval rating always around 40 had never been seen before for a president. And that's where he stood for the first 2 years of his presidency. So we're talking about 1994 here. So he had a very low approval rating. He had his signature domestic political plan, healthcare reform, had gone down the pan. He was being investigated more aggressively for the Whitewater affair, which was about the purchase of real estate on the Whitewater River in Arkansas. And Newt Gingrich, who was then minority, we're talking about before the midterms in 1994, he was the minority leader for the Republicans. He had just issued the Contract for America, this whole plan to galvanize America around a conservative agenda. And he claimed that Clinton was un-American, didn't represent American values, and that Clinton was a threat to American civilization. I mean, a fairly over-the-top sort of stuff. And in fact, arguably sort of the beginning of the sort of over-the-top polarization we see in American politics now. And the Republican message got through, and the Republicans pretty much swept the board in the midterms in 1994, and took control of the Senate and the House of Representatives, control of both for the first time since 1952. So in the run-up to this and over this period, we see Clinton completely politically at a low and not really knowing which direction to turn. His advisors are trying to sort of give him a new voice, a new rhetoric, a new way of communicating. His pollsters are saying you've got it all wrong. He's unhappy with the way he's being presented, as being too left wing and not representing American values. The whole situation is sort of needs a political and in particular a rhetorical and communication reset. And his advisors come across this idea that if you take some of the metaphors and the symbolism and the ideas of values of baseball, then perhaps they could use that to reset the way that Clinton talks about American community and American values and consensus and compromise. And the motivation for them doing that is the baseball series Ken Burns, by Ken Burns. Sorry, the motivation for doing that is the baseball series by Ken Burns, the history of baseball, a follow-up, if you like, to his Civil War series from 4 years earlier, which paints baseball as a metaphor for American history. We've already spoken about that. It paints the history of America in the 1920s as being seen through the lens of baseball, and the sort of language that Ken Burns talks in is something that Clinton's communicators think can be transferred to the voice of the president. And so that allows him to talk about the strike in terms of both American values and compromise, which is then what he does.
It certainly seems like the perfect opportunity for Clinton to recalibrate and improve his image, which it does kind of help a bit. And then we have the threat of Cal Ripken Jr.'s possible records throughout that time, possibly being a threat through the lack of games, the cancellation of games. How is Clinton able to take Cal Ripken Jr. after these strikes and help his image and help push through some of his welfare reforms? Because there's a clear tying together here now of Clinton and Labour and compromise, as you were saying.
So Cal Ripken is though Clinton would like to portray himself as the man that saved baseball, of course he didn't save baseball, because Clinton's efforts to end the strike didn't actually work, and the strike was ended by an agreement in the court in Manhattan, in the federal court in Manhattan, and Clinton's intervention actually didn't work. So I think we have to remember that, because what we're talking about is an intervention that didn't work, but a reset of language and focus that perhaps we then see materializing later. Of course, the person who did, in the eyes of many, save baseball is Cal Ripken Jr. And because he saved baseball, in the sense that he created a heroic narrative that Americans would identify with and then get back to the baseball park to experience, to get back to the to experience. Then Clinton's appropriation of it is all part of the same process, if you like. And the reason for Clinton's appropriation of Cal Ripken Jr. is quite simple. That Cal Ripken Jr., his record, which is, I said right at the beginning, was about consecutive games being played, just turning up for work every day, day in, day out, without missing a day's work for 13 years, tied in perfectly with Clinton's ideas about welfare reform, about the virtue of work. The work ethic is the foremost American virtue in Clinton's eyes. The idea that you turn up to work for an honest day's work was something that was very, very important for his political persona. And it was a key part of his domestic policy because he'd come in the 1992 campaign by saying he had a plan to end welfare as we know it. In other words, switch America from being a benefits orientated to society to a work-first society. Now, this is obviously very controversial, particularly controversial within his own party because it effectively was a conservative tool, political tool, ending benefits dependency. But he saw in Cal Ripken the perfect avatar for his argument that America had to switch from a benefit dependency society to a work society. And the guy that turned up for work every day was the symbol that Clinton thought he could use rhetorically as part of his argument for welfare reform. Welfare reform was having a very tough time, particularly before the 1994 elections when the Democrats controlled both the House and the Senate. Had a very, very difficult time getting consensus on welfare reform through, but he used Cal Ripken Jr. and this pursuit of this record very much as a vehicle through which he could make his arguments about the virtues of work for the American people.
It seems to be that Clinton's able to look to baseball as a way of helping him during periods of difficulty, times of difficulty, across his presidency. Now, I don't want to dwell too much on the event, but more so the type of pressure that Clinton was under. In 1998, Clinton was obviously in the middle of a scandal. How much pressure is Clinton actually under in 98?
Well, I think what you have to remember about the scandal involving Clinton and Monica Lewinsky is the fact that it covered so much of that year. I mean, the story broke in late January, and it's a year later where he's still going through the impeachment process as a consequence of it. And throughout that year, it basically diverted presidential attention and energy from almost any other topic. So in terms of the pressure of carrying out presidential duties, it was hugely impacted by the fact that he had to spend time with lawyers, he had to spend time defending himself, he wasn't able to gather political capital, and neither were his allies, because the conversation was all about this scandal rather than any of the other many things that were going on at the time. He had his initiative on race that he was trying to push forward, but that got completely submerged by the scandal. There were international crises, the financial crises, the collapse of the ruble, the world economy looked like it was collapsing. Americans were being bombed in East Africa at the embassies. There was Osama bin Laden to deal with, and yet nothing could get sort of media attention away from the scandal that was encompassing him, all the way from January, where he very first said, "I did not have sexual relations with that woman," all the way to the impeachment trial in the Senate a year later. The entire thing sort of consumed his presidency, and at some stages threatened completely to bring it to an end. I mean, going back to my time as a news producer, I was a producer for the BBC. Right at the beginning of the scandal, I was flown out from London to cover the story, and we flew out from London and we landed in Washington, and we were commissioned to make an hour-long program immediately we got there. And I discussed with the anchor at the time, who was a chap called Gavin Esler, an old BBC correspondent and presenter who was presenting. And he began the special with the words, "There's a smell of death around this presidency." So it shows you the degree to which people thought that actually this was going to bring Clinton down. And that idea that Clinton wasn't going to survive really lasted through much of 1998 and had various moments, such as when he gave evidence to the grand jury in August and when the Congress released the tapes of that evidence in September, that people thought he can't survive this. They genuinely thought there is no way that the nature of this scandal, not only the sort of sexual details and all that lot that come out, which are of course embarrassing, but the idea that he obstructed justice, that he got people to lie for him, all this sort of stuff, people felt that he couldn't possibly survive it. And really, it was only when the 1998 midterm elections came through and they weren't as good for the Republicans as they'd expected, and Newt Gingrich was eventually forced to resign as a result, that really you got the sense that actually Clinton might survive this scandal. So that degree of pressure was huge right throughout the year.
You know, I think that quote that he gave there from Gavin Esler really is a lovely quote that kind of sums it all up, and it kind of puts it all into perspective. But on the flip side of the coin, American baseball is going and witnessing this competition between Maguire and Sosa. Now, who were Maguire and Sosa, and what competition were they going through at that point?
So Mark Maguire and Sammy Sosa. Mark Maguire was the first baseman for the St. Louis Cardinals, and Sammy Sosa was an outfielder for the Chicago Cubs. And these two guys were just amazing, big-hitting home run hitters. And what materialized through the 1998 baseball season is that these two guys ended up having this sort of ferocious, in terms of sporting contest, and epic battle to break the record for the number of home runs scored in a season by a baseball player. Now, that record stood at 61 and had stood for 37 years, had been held by Roger Maris, and before Roger Maris, it had been held by Babe Ruth, and it was always slightly regarded as the Babe Ruth record. We could go into the sort of the arguments about Roger Maris and the controversy around him, which is sort of rather a fake controversy, really, at some other stage. But anyway, this is an iconic record in American sport, and these two guys are battling it out. And one moment, one of them's in the lead. They've got to try and hit 62 to beat the record. One moment, one's on 50 and the other's on 51. And then the next moment, they leapfrog and the other's ahead. And so basically from July onwards, this is completely dominating the American media, to the extent that that Dan Rather on CBS News, who's doing the evening news on CBS at the time, says, "I'm not going to do any other story at the top of my show. It's always going to be baseball. The latest on the baseball home run race is going to be at the top of my show. No matter what's going on in the world, no matter what's going on in the scandal around Clinton, that's going to be what we're going to do, because this story is good for America." And the narrative starts appearing in the press and even in sort of scholarly commentary everywhere, that somehow that this baseball contest is a way of diverting attention. America is looking for ways to think about other things apart from the scandal at the top of public life. And so if you've got a scandal at the top of public life from the president, then why can't we have this virtuous competition between two great baseball players at public life as well? And why can't we think about that instead? It's making up for the sins of the president. These two honorable guys are making up for the sins of the president. And there was endless comparison between Sosa and Maguire, who, though they had a fierce competition, it was friendly and it was honorable, versus Clinton versus Kenneth Starr, the prosecutor in the Lewinsky affair, who had this mutual enmity and they hated each other with a passion. So you had these two parallel stories going on together, and in some senses they they completely intertwine. So they would sit next to each other on the front page of newspapers. And in lots of occasions, the newspapers used to sort of refer to each story within the other. The politicians would say, why can't Clinton and Starr be more like Maguire and Sosa? So in the one story, the two dramas of 1998 were sort of playing out in the same space. And Clinton, in a sense, tried to capitalize on that, but didn't really succeed.
Well, you've just given me a perfect segue to my next question there. How was Clinton trying to use this to help himself? Because we've just seen that it's kind of trying to divert attention away from him, and it might have harmed him in a way as well.
So he sees this going on and he thinks, well, I want to be associated with that virtue. I want to be associated with those American values. So he starts telephoning the baseball players quite regularly during September as they reach various milestones. He's on the phone to them and doing it. And then on the night itself, of course, he telephones Maguire and tells him America's all with you on this, and it's absolutely great what you're doing. It's absolutely fantastic. You're a credit to America. And he's hoping that some of this sort of glory around this rubs off on him, and he then goes on campaign trips and starts talking about himself in the same terms as Maguire and Sosa, about hitting home runs from America and about never giving up like Maguire and Sosa don't give up. He rather bizarrely, the White House manufactures a photo opportunity on the campaign trail between him and the guy that catches the ball. The $1 million ball that Maguire hits the 60-second home run with is caught by a guy called Tim Foneris, who was a groundsman at Busch Stadium in St. Louis. And this guy's flown to Florida for a photo opportunity at Orlando Airport with Clinton. I mean, he's forever trying to associate himself with Maguire and Sosa, forever trying to bask in their reflected glory. He invites Sosa along to the White House to light the national Christmas tree. He invites Sosa to the State of the Union address at the beginning of 1999, which is held during his trial for impeachment. First time a professional baseball player has been honored at a State of the Union address, and Clinton points him out and gets Sosa to take a standing ovation. So there's all this stuff that goes on that Clinton is trying to get some personal redemption for by associating himself with the baseball players. But by and large, the media's not having it.
No, and you can see why he's trying to do it, but you can certainly see why they're not having it at the same time.
And they're saying, how dare you associate with yourself with these two virtuous guys when you're such an example of everything that's bad about America at the moment. And they're great, and they're virtuous and they're honourable, and you've let down your family, you've let down your country, you've lied throughout the summer. So I think, I think though he tried to do it, most of the media narrative were taking his attempts to do it and going, oh, no, we're not really having that. It doesn't really fit with the way that we see it. But of course, the other sort of element to that is, though Clinton was lying about his affair from all the way from January all the way through to finally admitting sexual relations with Lewinsky in August, the baseball players were lying as well. And that's another area where the two stories merge with each other, because both the baseball players and Clinton had a culture of concealment. Clinton was a concealment about his affair and what sort of person he was, and the baseball players was concealing the fact that they were souping themselves up on steroids.
And what was the reaction to that performance-enhancing drug scandal where Maguire and Sosa are tied up in?
Sosa isn't really tied up in it at all during 1998, in the sense that he wasn't part of the discussion. In fact, he was seen as somebody who was drug-free completely at the time. Comes to be questioned later. The problem for Mark Maguire is that a reporter in August spotted a bottle of pills called Andro in his locker after one game, and it turned out that this was a steroid precursor, not a steroid itself, but a steroid precursor that was not banned in baseball because baseball didn't have any drug testing then, but was banned in the NFL. It was banned in college sports, and it was banned in the Olympics. And it was a precursor that allowed you, as most steroids do, to train a little harder and recover more quickly. And Maguire was challenged about this in August at the height of the home run race. And for a few days, it became a bit of an issue because people thought, hey, you shouldn't, even though it's not illegal in baseball, you shouldn't be taking these drugs. Maguire was defiant about it. He said, it's not illegal. There's no reason why I shouldn't take it. You can't ban this sort of stuff. You could, all sorts of things that, supplements that we take that aren't banned. I'm perfectly happy to do it. And basically what happened is that no one really spotted that this was a sign that there was a bigger problem about steroids going on in baseball. There were more home runs being hit than ever before. The bodies were huge. The numbers were eye-popping. And here was evidence of someone taking a steroid precursor, and everybody said, but actually it's okay. It really isn't doing anything. And after about 3 or 4 days of sort of press coverage, which was a little lukewarm towards Maguire, basically I think the impulse came to play that America didn't want its heroic story that had been the antidote to the Clinton-Lewinsky scandal to contaminate their summer. They didn't want two scandals at the pinnacle of public life. So they decided, we'll just ignore the potential for a steroid scandal in baseball. And so it was. And Maguire got record crowds wherever he went. After a few days, the issue of Andrew basically disappeared from the conversation and didn't resurface again until the early noughties, when baseball players started going public about the degree of steroid taking there had been during the 1990s. And eventually, and we're talking about 10 years later, Maguire is forced to admit it. And incidentally, Sosa has never admitted it, though there are reports that he's tested positive for drugs in his time. So what we had were two parallel cultures of concealment going on in 1998. In the two dramas that were totally intertwined during 1998, the Lewinsky-Clinton scandal and the home run race, both of them were built on a lie, really.
It's interesting to see how baseball was able to keep that clean image for that time during that scandal, just to save themselves whilst the president is struggling to save himself. It's very interesting to see that happening at the same time. Now, we've had a great conversation about Bill Clinton and baseball and how the two intersect in the 1990s. But I have a final fun question for you, Chris, as we do for all the guests here on the History of Jackson podcast. Now, you've obviously written a book about baseball, and I want to ask you, what is your favourite baseball team and why?
So it's quite easy. It's the Red Sox. I started watching baseball regularly probably about 30 years ago, but it was really the Red Sox and the fact that they had such a, I'm not going to say pathetic story, but the story of the curse of the Red Sox. They hadn't won the World Series since Babe Ruth had left them in 1919. They hadn't won the World Series. And it was known as the curse of the Bambino, that they come close several times. They had some great players over the years. But for the best part of 90 years, they hadn't won a World Series. And then suddenly in 2004, they won the World Series. And I started really getting interested just before that and thinking, well, one day maybe the curse will be broken. And lo and behold, it was broken in 2004 in spectacular style, a fantastic World Series, which I got completely gripped by. And so then I suddenly found that, rather weirdly, if you're going to support an American baseball team, the only real place you can do it from the UK is on the East Coast, because on the East Coast, the time difference isn't so bad. So afternoon games start at quite a good time if you can catch them on telly, and evening games, maybe you might catch a bit of the early innings that start at midnight. And even better, on occasions you can nip out if you can find yourself a treat flight. You can nip out for a weekend, see a 3-game series at Fenway, and get home again and have your baseball hit for the season. So yeah, can't really do that in Los Angeles or anything else. Had to be an East Coast team. Couldn't be the Yankees. No one likes the Yankees.
I think that's a great team to support there. I think that's a great answer as well. So thank you very much for that. Now, obviously, people listen to us talk about your book, and we've not touched on everything we planned on touching on today, or even the rest of your book, which is fascinating. How can people grab a copy of your new book, Chris?
So you can get it. It's currently available on Amazon, as you'd expect. Usual places: Bill Clinton at the Church of Baseball by Chris Birkett on Amazon, or you can get it direct from the publishers, Mercer University Press in the United States. It's published in the United States, so delivery to the UK and Europe takes a bit longer than your usual Amazon sort of overnight time frame. But if you're in America, you can get it pretty quickly. So get along and get yourself a copy as soon as you can. That's what I'd say.
And I'd make sure a link for that is in the description below so people can find that really easily. And then how can they find you and interact with you online?
So I have a presence on, I was going to say Twitter, but I should say X, shouldn't I? I have a presence on X, at I Never Mention It. It's a long story why that's my handle, but at I Never Mention It is my handle on X. I posted quite regularly on LinkedIn. I find that's quite a good place for me to sort of talk to people and get reaction to what I'm doing. And I occasionally blog for the British Library, bl.org.uk, on baseball matters, in their Eccles Centre blog. The Eccles Centre for American Studies at the British Library is the sort of British Library bit for North America. And I blog there about baseball issues and stuff like that. So you can catch me there.
I certainly recommend following you on LinkedIn. You've put out some really great content there, and listening, looking at how your book has developed since we first connected on there has been brilliant. So I recommend going following Chris.
Great. Thanks very much, Jackson.
Thank you very much for coming on, Chris. I really appreciate it.
It's been a real pleasure, and thank you very much for inviting me, and wish you all success with your future podcasts. They're great.
Oh, thank you. So that was Chris Birkett talking all about his brand new book with Mercer University Press, Bill Clinton at the Church of Baseball, the Presidency, Civil Religion and the National Pastime in the 1990s. Now, I'm sure we can agree that podcast was really interesting. It was really interesting to hear about America and Clinton's struggles during the 90s through the prism of baseball, but also looking at baseball's issues within that decade through Clinton and America. Now, if you guys enjoyed this episode or any of the other episodes that we have made here so far at History of Jackson, please do consider supporting us through the Buy Me a Coffee profile in the description below, or by supporting us through History of Jackson Plus on Apple Podcasts. Next week, we have another awesome episode coming up, which I know you're all going to enjoy, so keep your ears peeled for that one. Until next week.